And so we start this new series today we're calling How to Get Through What You're Going Through. Anybody in here ever been through some things? How many would be really honest and say, it's not just behind me, I'm going through something today? And so we're talking about how to get through what you're going through. And I believe that there are people here today and watching online who are facing some uncertain situations, who are facing some difficulties, who are facing some struggles in your life. And I would think that if we were honest, even though we may never admit it, that there are some of us who would even say, I've wondered more than once if I was ever going to get through what I'm going through. If I was ever going to actually even make it through this thing that I'm going through. But I also believe that in this series, we are going to see some people finally get through the things that they've been going through. Finally get through the things that they haven't been able to encounter and overcome. And it might as well be you. I said it might as well be you. That's kind of the way I view it. Somebody's going to get their blessing. Somebody's going to get their breakthrough. Why not me? It might as well be you. Don't focus on where I am today. Don't focus on what I'm going through today. Don't focus on what I look like today, even though I may look all right. Don't focus on how I'm looking because I'm getting through this thing. I'm not staying here forever. I'm not dwelling here. This is not my final resting place. I'm getting through this thing. And so I want us to start this series in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 19. It's a pretty well-known story, but for those of you who maybe don't come from a church background or who are here because somebody said they were taking you to brunch and you ended up here and you're like, how did I get here? This is not what they promised me. I'll just give you a brief overview of the setup to this passage. See, there was a group of people called the Israelites who were in slavery and bondage to the Egyptians for many years. And so God, through a series of events and plagues, has orchestrated it to where Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, is now allowing the Israelites to have freedom and to go to the place that God had for them. And he's raised up a man by the name of Moses to help lead them out. But the Israelites have come to a stall. They've come to the Red Sea and they can't cross it. They have no way to cross this ginormous body of water, which they could go around it. But the problem is Pharaoh had a change of heart and the Egyptians are now hot on their trails. And so the Israelites are trying to figure out how to get through this thing as Pharaoh and his men are chasing them. And it says in Exodus 14, verse 19, then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. It says that the angel of God went from in front of them to behind them. How many know we always like to see God in front of us working? But in this moment, the angel of God went from in front to behind them. And I felt like I needed to point that out because I felt like someone needed to know that just because you feel like God is no longer leading you, it does not mean that he's left you. It may just mean that he had to go behind you and clean up some stuff that's trying to come back into your life. And so it says that throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other, so that neither went near the other all night long. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. And the waters were divided and the Israelites went through. Everybody say, I'm going through. They went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued them. See, sometimes we get confused because we feel like God told us that we were going to see the manifestation of what he said, and we feel like we see that thing, but then we see something pursuing us from behind, and we're trying to figure out, God, what is going on? Did I hear you wrong? Have you left me? Was I confused? Should I have not stepped out and done this thing? So that the Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. And during the last watch of the night, someone needs to know you're in the last watch of the night. You can't turn around and go back. You've come too far to stop now because you are in the last watch of the night. It may be dark, it may be confusing, it may be uncertain, but you're in the last watch. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire in the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. And he jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Here the Israelites have left a place of bondage and a place of confrontation for a place of promise. They've left this place where they were not able to do anything that God was wanting them to do for a place where God's taking them. But they're in the middle. And that's kind of the hardest part, isn't it? When you're not quite yet where you want to go, but you're no longer where you want to be. You're excited because you've moved on from the past, but you're not quite yet where you know God's trying to take you. And you're in the middle. That can be the hardest part. And so God gives Moses this instruction 2 times that we're going to look at this morning. He tells him to stretch out his hand over the Red Sea. To stretch out his hand over this thing that he can't cross. So I want to subtitle the message this morning for week 1 of how to get through what you're going through. I want to subtitle it, how to get through what you're going through, stretch it out. Everybody say stretch it out. Stretch it out. Let's pray. God, I thank you for today. I thank you that we have the opportunity and the privilege to come into your presence. God, I pray that you would just be with us for the next few moments, that you would just speak to our lives. God, I pray that you would put me on like a coat and wear me because I know that I cannot do this by myself. I pray that you would help me to be bold and to speak what you are wanting to be said. And I pray that you would help us to all have ears to hear and to apply what you say to our lives. In Jesus' name, and everybody said, amen. How many of you have ever had the privilege of driving a manual transmission vehicle? Stick shift, let me see, represent. Not a whole, okay, a little bit. How many of you would say, why in the world would I drive a car that I have to shift manually when I can drive one that does it for me? All right, well, I'm going to hate on y'all for a minute because I don't drive an automatic anymore. But you see, I used to drive an automatic. That's all I had ever driven was an automatic. And then a couple months ago, I bought a new car. When I say I bought a new car, I mean, I have payments. I'm not balling like all of you yet, so maybe the bank bought the car, but I got a new car. And I got this car, and, you know, I've always driven an automatic, but this car was a sports car, so I was kind of like, you know what? I want a stick shift. I have friends that drive stick shifts. I want a stick shift, even though I've never in my life driven a stick shift. And so I had to take my friend with me because he had to test drive the car, and he had to drive it home because I don't know how to drive a stick shift. So I bought a car that I've never driven before, and I don't know how to drive. Not a brighter thing that I've done in my life, but I knew that I wanted to learn, and that was the only way I would learn, is if I had no choice. So he takes it, he drives me home, and he gives me a lesson of how to drive this thing, and he says that you, as the clutch is in the ground, you let the clutch out, and you give it the same amount of gas. Sounds simple enough. So I'm like, I think I'm ready to go on the road. So I go out on the road, and what was happening was every time, I wasn't stalling out. Some of y'all think I was stalling out. No, I'm too good for that. I started squealing tires and rocketing everywhere I went. It's like, bam, taking off. Every red light. And I'm not a flashy person. I'm not a showy person. So this is embarrassing for me. Some of y'all are like, yeah, I'd like to show up. No, I'm like, everybody around me is like, what is this guy doing? He really thinks his car is that cool. It's that awesome. He has to show everybody. And little did they know, I wasn't showing off. I just didn't know what I was doing. Like, I just had no idea how to drive this thing. And so that was on Saturday. On Sunday, I drove it to church. I sped it on over to church, you know. Finally got here. After church, I asked Mom if she wanted to ride with me to lunch, and she said yes, because she didn't know that I had bought a stick shift. And so she gets in the car, and immediately I take off, and take off. And she realizes it's a stick shift, and she starts laughing hysterically. And I'm like, I don't know if you're laughing because you think it's funny or because you're scared and you're trying to laugh from keeping from crying. I don't know what's going on. And so she ends up texting my friend, and she says, listen, can you please give Dustin some more lessons because I'm scared. I think he's going to die. You know, I don't know that I'm going to be able to see him tomorrow. I feel like he may be in heaven. I don't know what's going on. And so he came, and he finally told me what I needed to know. And I got mad at him because I'm like, this should be the first thing you tell somebody. See, he had told me that as I let the clutch out to give it gas Wrong. You got to wait till the clutch starts to catch. So I was giving it way too much gas. That's why I was squealing my tires. But now I'm stalling out. Now the struggle is real because I can't find the happy medium. And so I started to feel a little confident. So I had to go to Atlanta one day, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to drive this thing down to Atlanta. Even though I still had my automatic vehicle in the garage because I hadn't turned it in yet. And I'm like, I'm going to drive this thing, which is a terrible decision because, listen, if I'm being real, I can't even drive an automatic car downtown. So much less a stick shift. And so I get down there by the grace of God. I mean, he helped me out and everything. I get down there, and as soon as I get to this street that I needed to turn left on, it was the prize. It was where I was trying to get. There's this light, and it doesn't have a green arrow. And there's traffic for days. So what you have to do is wait for the light to turn red, and you're already out in the middle of the intersection, and then you go. So I'm freaking out. I'm finally at the front of the line, and every time I would have to move up, it was like, and stop. And I didn't want to stall out, so I took off. Tires squeal. Everybody's looking at me. I freak out. I'm in the middle of the intersection. I let up off of everything. And the car dies, stalls out. So I'm sitting in the middle of the intersection. The light is red. The people coming perpendicular has turned green, and I'm stalled out. So I'm freaking out, and I start the car back up. I got push start for a reason because I knew this would happen a lot. So I start the car back up, stall out. Start the car back up, stall out. Start the car back up, stall out. Finally, I just turn my hazard lights on. I'm just like. And this guy, he comes, they're driving around me, and this guy's waving at me. And so I'm like, what a friendly guy. I'm waving. I'm like, you know what? People downtown are not that bad. This is a great guy. And I'm thinking, he's like, go get him, Tiger. You'll get it eventually. It's okay. Until he got closer, and I realized he wasn't waving all 5 fingers. And so it was a little less of an encouragement in that situation. Wow, that took some of y'all a really long time. Okay. Well, thankfully, we know you're not the type, okay? Because I know some of y'all are like, I'd have done the same thing to you if you were sitting blocking the intersection. But you see, I sped out into the intersection, but once I was actually in the middle, I stalled. And if I'm being honest, my immediate thought was, I really wish I hadn't pulled out here at all. I wish I had just stayed back where I was because I was in the middle. And once I was in the middle, I was surrounded. And I was immediately tempted with going back to where I had come from. Because in our lives, whenever we get into the middle of something, our greatest temptation is to always go back to where we left. And it's amazing how quickly we forget what made us leave in the first place. And so in Exodus chapter 14, the Israelites have finally left where they were leaving, but they were not yet where God was taking them, and they were in the middle. And they were facing this temptation to go back to the place that they had left. They had had their breakthrough. They had left their past. They had left their oppression. They had left their slavery. But they were in the middle, and they wanted to go back to where they left. Because the hardest thing is not to start something. We always think if I can just get started, right? Like if I can just get started writing this paper, if I can just get started with a marriage, if I can just get started raising my kids, then it'll all come easy. But starting is not the hardest part. It's the hardest part comes once you have the faith to start and you actually have to go through the middle of the situation. That's when it's most difficult. That's when it takes the greatest faith. Why? Because fear and doubt always show up in the middle. Fear and doubt don't bother you in the beginning. Fear and doubt always show up once you get into the middle, once it's uncertain, once you don't really know what you're going to do. And so for the first thing on your notes this morning, I want you to see that your focus should not be on how do I fear less, but how do I trust God more? Because the middle is scary. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know the answers. You don't have the answers. It's scary, but we get so concerned with how can I just not be afraid that we forget to put our faith in the one who can take away our fears. So we should focus more on trusting in God than how do I not be afraid in this situation. Because in Exodus 14, God is saying to the Israelites, he's saying, listen, I have you right where I want you, in front of the Red Sea. And I brought you to the Red Sea, which is a body of water that's too large for you to cross on your own, because there's some things in your life that I need to get rid of. Because if I don't get rid of those things, then you'll return to them. You'll go back to where you came from. You'll go back to the things that you were tied to. And so in our lives, we come to the middle and we face these situations and we get to a difficulty. And we think that maybe God changed his mind. Maybe he didn't really want us to do this thing. And we miss God and we need to go back to where we came from. But God is saying, this is exactly where I want you, because this is the only way I'm going to be able to get things out of your life that you keep wanting to run back to. Have you ever noticed how you feel so good when you leave something, but then you're gone for a little bit and you want to go back? And God's saying, I know that eventually you'll want to go back as it gets uncomfortable, but you can't go back, because if you keep going back, then you'll never go forward. And you'll never go where I'm trying to take you. And so what happens to the Israelites here is the same thing that happens to each and every one of us, in that they left Egypt and they get to this place that they cannot cross. And Moses stretches out his arm and the waters part, and it's awesome. It's exciting. It's always awesome and exciting when you actually see God physically moving, when you can actually see what he's doing. But then when they get into the middle, they start to have second thoughts. And they start to doubt what they're doing, and they want to go back. It's like, God, I'll do anything you want me to, as long as it's easy, as long as I don't have any opposition or any adversity. And so they get out into the middle, and they want to go back to where they came from, because Pharaoh had a change of heart, and Pharaoh is pursuing them viciously. And so now the Israelites are upset because they've seen their security leave. They've seen their comfort leave, because even though where they had left was not comfortable, it was at least convenient. It was safe. You see, where they were in Egypt was safe. They were alive. They knew what was going to happen. They knew that even though they were in slavery and bondage, they at least knew everything. It was familiar. Don't allow the familiarity of your past to rob you of the future that God has for you. Don't allow the comfort of everything that you've always known and been used to stop you from stepping out into the thing that God has for your life. And so they start complaining to Moses. And they start saying some of the same things that we say to God. Whenever he's taken us out of something into something, and we're in the middle. And they start complaining, because, see, I used to always shout. I don't know about y'all. I used to shout when people would say we're in the middle of a miracle. I used to shout when people would say we're in the middle of a move of God. I grew up my whole life hearing we're in the middle of a move of God. And I'd shout, I'd get excited, everybody'd shout. And they shouted because they didn't realize that the middle is actually the hardest part. The middle is actually extremely uncomfortable. Because the finish line is great. The starting block is exciting. Everybody likes starting something new. But it's the middle. It's the middle that separates those who have actual true faith from those who have a fairy tale, from those who have a fantasy of what they want to see. See, the middle is able to help God separate those who actually want to do what he wants them to do and those who just want to do what's convenient for them. But in verse 8 it says that the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. Boldly. See, that's how we are in church. Bold. And we should be. That's great. But we're in church and we believe everything. We know God's going to do it. We know God's going to help see us through. We know we're going to make it through. It's awesome. It's exciting on Sunday. But then Monday comes, and by Monday afternoon, we're not so sure anymore. And by Tuesday, we really don't know if we're going to make it through this thing. And then the whole week goes, and we get there on Sunday, and we're bold again, and it's awesome, it's exciting. And we know God's going to do it. But then Monday, and it's a cycle that we go through where we're bold, because, see, even though they were bold, and it was great when they were leaving, the problem is it's easy to be bold when you're not in the middle of a battle. It's easy to be bold when you're in the safety and the comfort and the security of a situation with no adversity. But what God is looking for is someone who will be bold even when they don't know. even when they're uncertain, even when they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, even though they just know they're in the middle of something, they don't know how to get out of it, but they don't want to go back to where they came from, so they keep moving forward in their faith with him. Because all the Israelites knew was that they had left. In verse 8, all they knew is that they were leaving. They did not yet know that they were being pursued. They did not yet know that they were about to face some adversity. Because it's easy to be bold when you're not facing adversity. It's easy to be bold and have faith when you have enough money in the bank. It's easy to be bold and have faith when your marriage is like a fairy tale. It's easy to be bold and have faith when you even know who you're going to marry and that you're not going to be alone your whole life. It's easy to be bold and have faith whenever you see your children doing everything that you want them to do. But what God is looking for, what he is pleading for and begging for and wanting to see are some people who will still be bold and have faith even in the middle of their adverse situation, even when they don't have enough money in the bank, even when they don't know who they're going to marry, even when their marriage is on the rocks, even when their children are running from God. He's looking for some people who will still be bold in the middle of their situation, in the middle of going through what they're going through. Because the Israelites are strutting their stuff out of Egypt. I mean, they're borderline cocky walking out of there. They're like, yeah, you used to beat me, now watch my back as I leave. That's what they're doing. They're pumped, they're excited, they're bold. They're saying, I bet you these Israelites, because I would, are looking at the Egyptians that used to beat them and making faces at them, saying smart aleck comments, telling them their mama's ugly, saying all kinds of mean things because they're like, I'm never going to have to see you again. And so now when they see these same Egyptians chasing after them and they remember what they've done, they're starting to get a little nervous. But it says in verse 10 that they kind of see and realize that things aren't as they seem. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. I don't know, am I the only one that ever feels like every time I look up, there's something staring me right in the face? Like every time I look up, it's another obstacle. Like every time I look up, it's another problem, it's another situation, it's another uncertainty. And so they look up and they see the Egyptians marching after them, and they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. See, they were bold until the battle comes. They were bold until the adversity came. And they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What a bold statement. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone and let us serve the Egyptians? These jokers were begging to leave Egypt when they were in slavery. They were bold as they left. But the moment the battle came, they immediately wanted to go back to where they had come from. They immediately wanted to go back to the thing that had held them for so long, because it was safe and it was familiar and they knew what would happen. And that's why the second thing and last thing I want you to see on your notes this morning is that you have to stretch again. You have to stretch again because, see, they had made the easy stretch. The easy stretch came when they left Egypt. And it was easy because there was no opposition. It was easy because there was no adversity. It was easy because it wasn't a struggle. There was nothing around them that was uncertain. They knew that they were leaving. They knew they were going to where God had promised them. And it was easy for them to make that first stretch. But now they're faced with another decision where they have to decide, do I want to keep trying to go forward where God's taking me and risk not knowing what's going to happen? Or do I want to go back to where I came from? Do I want to go back to Egypt? Do I want to go back to where it was comfortable, where I knew that I would be alive? And so God gives Moses this instruction to get through this situation. He tells Moses to stretch out his hand over the Red Sea. This is the first time he tells Moses to stretch. He says to stretch out your hand over the Red Sea, this thing that is bigger than you, this thing that you can't cross over by yourself. I want you to stretch your mind. I want you to stretch your thinking. I want you to stretch your faith over this thing that you can't do on your own. He says, I want you to stretch it over this thing. And if you will stretch your hand over this thing that you can't cross on your own, then I'll apply my strength so that you can see that nothing is too big for me and that I can do anything that you need me to do. So he tells Moses to stretch out his hand. He tells him to stretch it out. Everybody say, stretch it out. He says, stretch it out. Stretch this thing that doesn't seem like it's good enough. Stretch this thing that seems like it's disqualified. Stretch this thing that seems like it doesn't have what it takes. Stretch this thing that seems like it has no power. He tells him to stretch out his arm over the Red Sea. And I felt like one thing that God really wanted to bring to this message today, and if you don't hear anything else I say, then hear me on this, is that some of us would approve and want and desire the familiarity and the security of slavery over the uncertainty of going forward. Some of us would prefer the security of being tied to the things that have been holding us back our entire lives, that have been keeping us in bondage, that have been stopping us from living for God, that have been stopping us from seeing what God promised. We'd rather be tied to that and that security in that than we would the uncertainty of going through something. And so we wonder why we never make any progress. And we wonder why we're always facing the same thing. And why we're in the same place. And we can't see the thing that we've been believing for. And why we're always alone. And why we're always in trouble. And why we always stay stuck. Because every time we get to the middle of going through something, we just want to go back to the thing that we know. The thing that we're comfortable with. And so God, he gives Moses this instruction, and he tells him to stretch out his hand over the sea. And he says, if you will stretch out your hand over this thing, then I will show you my power. I will show you my strength. If you'll stretch it, I'll make a way. If you'll stretch it, I'll make it easy. And that's what Jesus did for us when he died on the cross, by the way. He made a way for us to cross over. He made a way for us to cross over from death to life. From sin to righteousness, from brokenness to wholeness, from sickness to health. He made a way for us to cross over. But the scripture says that the pillar and the cloud and the angel of God, they went from in front of them to behind them. And they must have thought, I've thought this, I don't even know how many times in my life. I'm not ashamed to say, I'm a little ashamed, but I'll tell you. They must have thought, God's leaving me. God's left me out on my own. He brought me out here, and now he's gone. He brought me out here, and he's just going to leave me to die on my own. They felt like God was leaving them, but see, he wasn't leaving them. He was just leading them from a different position. Because see, he had to go and to set a gap and to set some separation between them and their past, between them and their enemy. He had to separate them from themselves and the thing that they were tempted to return to. He had to separate their faith from their sight. Because if we could always see where God was leading us, we'd have no reason to have faith and to trust in him. And so God said, I'm going to go from in front of you to behind you so that I can create some separation between your faith and your sight. And so he goes from in front of them to behind them. And the Israelites can't see where he's leading, but they're going through this thing. And the entire time they're going through it, they're thinking, God, why did you bring me out here? God, what was the point? Why did you get my hopes up? Nobody will be that honest. God, I finally got my hopes up that this was my chance. I was finally going to see it. I had my hopes up. I was able to move from that thing to here, but now I'm in the middle. Why did you bring me out here? What? Because even though where they were was not safe or was not joyful, at least they were safe. They may not have been very happy. They may not have been able to do what God wanted them to do, but at least they were alive. In their minds now, they're fixing to die. And so they're like, God, why would you bring me out here? And if we're honest, many of us have prayed and thought the same thing. God, why did you bring me out here into this uncertain situation? Why am I having to go through what I'm going through? Why am I having to face this thing? But I felt like God wanted me to tell you today that he didn't bring you out here so that you would drown. He brought you out here because he knows your enemies can't swim. And so he had to bring you out into that thing so that he could drown out your enemies. And so I'm preaching to somebody today who's going through something right now. I mean, right in this minute, you came in here today thinking about it. When you go out the door, you'll be thinking about it. You're going through something right now. And I wanted to give you an instruction of how to handle that situation. You need to stretch out your hand again. You need to stretch it out again because, see, Moses stretched out his hand over the Red Sea to part it. He stretched out his hand over the Red Sea the first time. But once the Israelites got through that thing, once the Israelites got through to the other side, somebody say, stretch it out. See, because God was taking them to a new place, to a new promise, to a new provision, to a new blessing, to a new life, to a new situation. God is taking you somewhere. God's taking you somewhere. It's not over for you. You're not going to die here. This is not the end for you. This is not your final resting point. You're going through. I said you're going through. But you need to know what to do when you get through it. When you get to the other side, you need to stretch out your hand again. Because when they got to the other side, I want you to look at what happened in verse 26. They got to the other side and it says, God's like, you know what? Now that you made it through it, stretch out your hand over the sea. Stretch out your hand over the sea. The same sea that they had just come through. The same sea that was their obstacle, but now they're on the other side. He says to stretch out your hand over the sea. Now that you've made it through, now that you've gone through some things, now that you've been in my presence, now that you've trusted in me, now that you've seen me work, now that cancer didn't kill your body, now that divorce didn't take you out, now that the bankruptcy didn't stop you, now that you've been through some things, here's what I want you to do. I want you to stretch your hand back over everything that you just came through. I want you to stretch it out again. Because he said, stretch out your hand over the sea. Everybody just stretch out your hand. Stretch out your hand so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen. So that the waters can flow back over everything that's been tormenting your mind. Everything that's been troubling you. Every uncertainty in your life that's been making you doubt whether or not you were ever going to make it. Making you doubt whether or not you would ever be happy. Making you doubt whether or not you would ever see what God's promised you. Making you doubt whether or not you'd ever be able to do the ministry that God created you to do. I want you to stretch it out so that I can drown every doubt in your mind. I just have one last thing to say and I'll be out of your way. I wanted to tell you why God brought you out to deep waters. I wanted to tell you why you're having to go through what you're going through. The uncertainty, the fear, the doubt. I want you to know why you had to go through what you're going through, because your doubts cannot drown on dry ground. It has to be a place where you look to your left and you see something bigger than you. You look to your right and you see something bigger than you. You look behind you and you see your past chasing you down. You see your fears chasing you down. You see your doubts chasing you down. And the only way forward is faith. The only way forward is faith. Your doubts and your fears and your temptations and your past cannot drown on dry ground. They can't die on dry ground. You have to move forward. You've come too far to stop and to turn back now. You have to keep going forward in that situation, because God said, I brought you into deep waters so that I could drown out your doubts. I didn't just want to bring you out of Egypt. I wanted to drown Egypt out of you. I wanted to make sure that Egypt could never come back into your life. I wanted to make sure that those fears could never come back into your mind. I wanted to make sure that those doubts could never come back into your life. I had to drown that thing out of you. And God, I thank you for bringing us into deep waters. God, I thank you that we may be surrounded on every side, but I thank you that we're going through it. I thank you that we won't go back to where we came from. I thank you that we won't go back to the things that held us before. And even though it may be difficult right now, even though we may not be certain right now, even though we may be facing some things right now, God, I thank you that we are going through. God, we won't go back to the familiarity behind us. We won't go back to the things behind us. We're breaking out of complacency. We're breaking out of the things that we've always known. We're breaking out of the familiar. We're going forward. We're taking new territory. We're going to see the things that you have for our lives. I would ask if everyone would please stand.